On April 18, 2003, in front of the Modesto County Courthouse in California, hundreds of reporters crowded together, microphones and cameras pressed close. The angry crowd shouted, "Murderer! Cold-blooded man!" A man was handcuffed, his blue shirt was wrinkled, his face was tense, but he still tried to keep calm. He was Scott Peterson, the husband who was once admired by the whole neighborhood, the man who was once described as the ideal model of a warm little family. But now, in front of the public, Scott was no different from the embodiment of crime. Accused of murdering his own wife, Laci Peterson, his wife was 8 months pregnant and their unborn child. People called this case the trial of the century, a tragedy that opened on Christmas Eve. And ironically, Christmas is the season of miracles, smiles, and reunions. But for the Peterson family, it was the beginning of an irreversible tragedy. Imagine this. On Christmas Eve, instead of sitting by the sparkling pine tree, sipping cookies and hot milk, the police have to run around looking for a missing pregnant woman. And that missing person is none other than the gentle wife Laci Peterson, with a full belly, only a few weeks away from giving birth. Disappearing in silence, without a trace, not a single text message, not a single phone call. Instead of bustling Christmas music, the neighbors hear police sirens and helicopters hovering in the sky. The husband, Scott, said he went fishing. Yes, fishing on Christmas Eve. To be honest, in Vietnam, it would be okay for a man to be excited about going fishing on Christmas. But in California, USA, in the middle of winter, while his wife is pregnant, the pleasure of Christmas fishing sounds a bit wrong. And from that wrong-sounding story, all the secrets gradually revealed. Hello everyone, I am 2D Crime Files, and this is the True Crime video series, where we are both scared, curious, and sometimes even laugh because of the unbelievable real details. In today's series, I will take you back to one of the most shocking cases in America in the early 2000s, the disappearance of Laci Peterson. A tearful story, tense twists, and irony that has outraged public opinion for many years. But rest assured, I will not let you sink into a heavy atmosphere all the time. Interspersed between the chilling details, I will add a few humorous narrations to make you both excited and unable to take your eyes off. Because, if true crime was only cold, it would be easy to be overwhelmed, but with a little warmth from the narrator's voice, we can complete this 25,000-word journey. So, what really happened that Christmas? How did a once-celebrated husband suddenly become the curse of America? And how did an affair lead to such a devastating tragedy? Let's start with Christmas Eve 2002, when everything seemed peaceful, but just a few hours later, everything changed forever. December 24th, 2002, Modesto, California, must have been a day that everyone looked forward to. Christmas, a holiday of happiness and love. A season of family gatherings, gifts, and the ringing of bells. However, for the Peterson family, that Christmas became a dark milestone that no one could forget. Laci Peterson, 27 years old, was pregnant with the son that she and her husband Scott Peterson had been waiting for 8 months. She has long brown hair, bright eyes, and a bright smile. People around her always say that she is a beautiful, energetic woman who always takes care of her family. She and Scott have been married for 3 years and have always lived in a beautiful house in Modesto, where they have built a home full of love. This Christmas, Laci was eagerly preparing for the big day, but everything changed overnight. When her husband, Scott Peterson, woke up early in the morning, she was gone. There was no message, no sign of where she had gone, just an empty space and an unclaimed Christmas basket. However, before we start to delve into this disappearance, let's take a look at the Peterson family background, as well as the relationships that Scott and Laci have built over the years. They're not strangers to the community. On the contrary, they're a happy couple in the eyes of everyone. Everyone thinks their lives are perfect. But, as you know, things aren't always what they seem. Laci Peterson has always been a standout in the community. She is a passionate kindergarten teacher who always finds ways to help children and inspire her students. She's a responsible wife, mother, and a trusted friend. She and Scott, her husband with his charming smile and elegant appearance, are admired by many for their harmonious family life. But that's just the surface picture. Behind the doors of the Peterson house, there are dark secrets that we only begin to see clearly when Laci goes missing. That morning, after Scott woke up and realized his wife wasn't home, he searched the house but couldn't find her. He called Laci's family and reported her missing. That night, while Scott continued to search the area, the neighbors became worried and called the police. Scott called the police and said he hadn't been able to find his wife since early in the morning. The police began investigating, but they couldn't find any trace of Laci outside the house, only a few items left behind as if she had left in a hurry. The police suspected that something had happened right in the house. Strangely, when Scott told the police that he had gone fishing in Berkeley Bay that morning, some people began to ask questions. Who would go fishing on Christmas when the family was preparing for the holidays? And that was just the first step of bigger questions that would start to arise. The police, at first, were not too concerned about Laci's disappearance. They thought she had simply gone somewhere alone, maybe for a little outing or a get-together with friends. But as they began to examine the scene and saw signs of unusual behavior in Scott's actions, they gradually realized that this disappearance might not be as simple as it seemed. Whenever people think about cases like this, we easily see signs of a troubled relationship. But Scott and Laci, in everyone's eyes, were the ideal couple. So what happened between them that made everything fall apart overnight? After a few hours, the search was expanded. The police began to collect evidence, clues, and brought in experts. The atmosphere was tense, and searches were organized all over Modesto. Search parties were split up, searching the area for any trace of Laci. Some felt she might have been abducted, but there was another unexpected theory that Scott, the husband everyone thought was perfect, might have something to do with her disappearance. As the police continued to investigate and expand the search area, questions began to arise. Why had Scott been absent all morning when Laci was pregnant and about to give birth? And if she was truly missing, why was there no sign of abduction or accident? These questions were just the tip of the iceberg, and in a few days, investigators would begin to uncover even stranger clues. Christmas 2002, with such a sad event, shook the Modesto community. Not only are people worried about Laci's disappearance, but they are also starting to doubt her husband, Scott Peterson. Is he really innocent? Or is everything just part of a criminal plan that Scott has been planning for a long time? To answer this question, we will have to go further, entering into complex investigations, shocking details, and unexpected secrets. When Laci Peterson went missing, the public and police turned to Scott Peterson, her 28-year-old husband, in the hope that he might provide vital clues. Scott was no stranger to the community. He was a model husband, a gentleman, a responsible man, known for his calm lifestyle and happy family. Scott had married Laci in 1997, and despite the difficulties of their marriage like any couple, they had stuck together throughout those years. When Laci went missing, Scott was the first to report her disappearance to the police. He reported that he had gone fishing in Berkeley Bay that morning. This seemed reasonable to some, as fishing was a hobby of Scott's and was supposed to be part of his vacations. However, when the details of the fishing were examined closely, they began to seem implausible. According to Scott's account, he woke up early on the morning of December 24th and drove to the fishing grounds, about 50 minutes from his home. Police immediately began to have doubts about this story. First, they noticed that no one in the area could recall seeing Scott or any of his cars at the fishing grounds at the time he said. Furthermore, the fishermen there did not recall Scott being at the fishing grounds that morning. So, had Scott really gone fishing, or was he just trying to create a cover for what he had been doing all morning? Police's suspicions grew as they began to examine the details of Scott and his relationship with Laci more closely. Scott's friends began to report that his behavior had changed recently. Before Laci went missing, he seemed less interested in his wife than he had been. Their conversations had become cold and distant. However, there was one notable detail. Scott always spoke lovingly about Laci in front of others. But when no one was looking, he would either go silent or act cold. One of the things that many people began to suspect was Scott's actions after Laci went missing. He did not appear to panic like a husband would when his wife mysteriously disappeared. During the first hours after Laci went missing, Scott did not look for his wife. Instead, he just stood outside the house and waited. The police began to feel that his coldness was strange, and they decided to find out more about what he did that day. What made the police and the community feel even more confused was that Scott seemed quite calm throughout the investigation. Usually, in a missing person case like this, the relatives would be extremely worried and emotional. But Scott was different. He didn't shed a tear, didn't show any signs of pain or panic. Some people began to speculate that Scott might know something that others didn't, and that he was trying to hide a dark secret. As the police began to piece together the clues from Scott's life, they discovered a suspicious detail: Amber Frey. A woman named Amber Frey entered Scott's life in early 2002. Amber was a single woman living in Fresno, and she met Scott through a friend. For a long time, Scott and Amber had a secret sexual relationship. However, Amber didn't know that Scott was married, and it was only after Laci went missing that Amber discovered that Scott had lied about his life. From here, everything began to fall apart. Amber Frey approached the police and became a key witness in the case. In the recordings and phone calls collected by the police, Scott admitted that he did not love his wife, but was living a fake life to hide his affair with Amber. Scott's calls to Amber showed that he was not distressed or worried about his wife's disappearance, but on the contrary, he felt relieved and free. After Scott and Amber's conversations came to light, the police began to suspect that Scott may have had a deep connection to his wife's death. This evidence seemed to paint a picture of a man who planned to get rid of his wife so he could start a new life with his lover. Thus, an unexpected twist appeared in this case. Amber Frey, an innocent woman, inadvertently became an important link in bringing Scott Peterson to light. And the biggest question of all is Scott Peterson the killer the public has been looking for? As the police dig deeper into Scott's life, they uncover more and more clues. Was the truth behind Laci Peterson's death as simple as Scott says? As soon as Laci Peterson disappeared, the public's attention focused on Scott Peterson, the husband that everyone thought was perfect. But as a veil of secrecy was gradually lifted, unexpected details began to appear, revealing that Scott was not the ideal husband that everyone imagined. And that started with a woman named Amber Frey. Amber Frey was a young woman, living in Fresno, California, an active single mother. In December 2002, when Scott and Laci were in the final stages of pregnancy, Scott met Amber through a friend. After Scott's sweet words, Amber quickly fell in love with him. She did not know that Scott was married, and when he told her that he was separated, Amber completely believed this story. The relationship between Scott and Amber progressed quite quickly. They saw each other regularly, and although Amber sensed that Scott might be a special man, she had no doubt that he was married. Their relationship was largely based on phone calls and weekend meetings, with romantic conversations and occasional trips away. Scott convinced Amber that he was waiting for a new life, that he had completely drifted away from his wife and was just waiting for the right moment to start a long-term relationship with her. Text messages and phone calls between Scott and Amber were regularly recorded, and they would be a key piece of evidence in the investigation. But one important detail that Amber did not know was that when she and Scott met, Laci Peterson, his pregnant wife, was home, unaware that her husband was living a secret life. On Christmas Eve 2002, when Laci went missing, Amber had no idea that Scott's wife had disappeared. She continued to have conversations with Scott as usual, even assuming that he would join her for the holidays. But then everything changed when the police started to collect evidence, and Amber discovered that Scott had not only lied about the separation, but had also hidden the truth about his family ties. As soon as the police contacted Amber, she was shocked, not only because of the truth about Scott, but also because she realized that she had been deceived from the beginning, especially when she heard the recordings between her and Scott, in which he even shared with her that Laci was pregnant with the son he was so looking forward to. It was a huge shock to Amber, and she decided to cooperate with the police to clear up the case. When Amber Frey began to reveal information about her relationship with Scott, the police quickly realized that this could be the key to unlocking the mystery behind Laci's disappearance. The phone calls, text messages, and secret meetings between Scott and Amber paint a picture of lies and betrayal. Scott not only lied to Amber, but he lied to everyone around him, especially his wife, Laci. The phone calls that the police collected between Scott and Amber further revealed Scott's lies. One notable call was when Scott told Amber, "Laci is not the most important person in my life anymore. I'm looking for a new life." This not only confused Amber, but also made the police realize that Scott may have been planning to get rid of his wife and start a new life with Amber. From here, the story becomes more complicated. Scott is not only a cheating man, but he is also trying to create the perfect cover to hide his secrets. Scott and Amber's encounters were not just romantic moments of an affair. They were also conversations filled with unacceptable lies. In his conversations with Amber, Scott tried to convince her that he loved her and wanted to build a future together. But when questioned by the police, Scott could not explain why he made such statements while his wife was pregnant with his child. Scott's words began to have obvious contradictions, and this increased the police's suspicions. One of the notable details was when Amber revealed that Scott had told her that he would fix his wife's problems so that he could move forward with a relationship with her. This made the police unable to help but think that Scott may have intended to eliminate Laci all along. Not only did they find evidence of infidelity, but they also realized that Scott may have planned everything from making Laci disappear to creating the perfect story to cover up his actions. As information about Scott's affair became public, American public opinion began to change. Scott's friends also began to feel confused and suspicious. While some still believed that Scott could be innocent, others began to view him with suspicion, especially when some people began to, as they began to talk about the change in Scott's behavior, they began to believe that he was not the ideal husband they had imagined. The police continued to dig deeper into Scott's life and his relationships. Investigations into Scott's finances, meetings, and actions further convinced people that he was not only having an affair, but also had criminal plans related to eliminating his wife. The big question now was Laci's death really an accident, or was it a premeditated plot? This chapter opened an important part of the Laci Peterson case, as the secrets of Scott's sexual relationship with Amber Frey gradually came to light. These details not only changed the investigation, but also highlighted the inconsistencies in Scott's behavior and words. With each new clue, the truth about Laci Peterson's death becomes clearer. But is it the truth? After the first clues about Laci Peterson's disappearance were discovered, a large-scale search was organized. The area near her home in Modesto, California, was carefully checked. However, as all hope faded, the case took a dramatic turn in April 2003. But before we get to that stage, we need to look back at the early days of the investigation. On December 24th, 2002, when Laci Peterson disappeared, Modesto police immediately launched a large-scale search. Rescue teams, along with police and canine units, searched the entire area near the Peterson family home. They checked every nook and cranny in the Modesto area and the surrounding rivers and woods. Police also searched areas that might have been linked to Laci's possible abduction or accident. However, the search yielded no clear results. The first days of the investigation were not very optimistic. Laci had no trace. There were no signs of a murder, nor any clues that she had been kidnapped or had an accident. But strangely, Scott Peterson, Laci's husband, did not show any anxiety or grief as a husband should when his wife goes missing. Instead, he appeared quite calm and even continued to go to work while his wife was missing. This made the police begin to suspect the truth behind Laci's disappearance. This suspicion only increased when further investigation revealed Scott's strange actions during the days after Laci went missing. While search teams searched everywhere, Scott just stood outside the house, not participating in the search. He did not seem to be in a hurry to find his wife. This further fueled suspicions that Scott might know something that others did not. In April 2003, investigators began to find a major lead. After months of searching, they finally discovered the bodies of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor Peterson, dumped on the shores of San Francisco Bay. The bodies were found in a state of decomposition, but still identifiable enough. In fact, the discovery of Laci and Connor's bodies created a huge stir. It made people realize that Laci's disappearance was not a simple accident or incident. It could have been a deliberate act, and Scott Peterson was the first suspect. As soon as Laci's body was discovered, the police began to question Scott Peterson's actions once again. Laci's body was found about 30 miles from the Peterson family home, even though Scott had said he had not left. Although there was no clear evidence that Scott had killed his wife, this caused investigators to reconsider his story. If Laci had been kidnapped, why was her body found so far from home? Police were shocked not only by the discovery of Laci and Connor's bodies, but also by the way Scott acted after hearing the news. He showed no signs of remorse or grief. During his interviews with police, Scott maintained a cool demeanor and showed no surprise or panic. This further increased suspicion that he might have been involved in his wife's death. Shortly after Laci and Connor's bodies were found, prosecutors began to consider taking Scott to court. A major investigation into Scott and his actions was launched. Police and prosecutors spent time trying to find out the details of what happened before and after Laci disappeared. These details would help them build a clear picture of what really happened on Christmas Eve 2002. To further unravel the mysterious circumstances of the case, police began looking into evidence of calls and text messages between Scott and Amber Frey. They wanted to determine whether Scott's sexual encounters were related to Laci's disappearance. Phone recordings between Scott and Amber were brought to light, and everyone was shocked to hear the lies and contradictions in those calls. In Scott's conversations with Amber, he repeatedly stated that Laci was no longer an important person in his life. Not only did this leave Amber feeling deceived, but the public began to realize that Scott was not grieving over his wife's disappearance. Scott even shared with Amber that he would soon leave the marriage and start a new life with her. This was a detail that further clarified that Scott had planned to get rid of Laci all along. The clues discovered from the search for Laci's body not only helped the police clarify the details of the case, but also created a special public interest. The Modesto community and surrounding areas could not help, but the family was shocked to learn that Laci had been brutally murdered. They began to suspect that Scott Peterson, the husband they had imagined as a model husband, might be the culprit. The public was further shocked when Scott was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife and unborn son. This opened a new phase in the case, as prosecutors began preparing for a trial that was expected to last months. And then Scott Peterson was put on trial in a huge courtroom, where every detail, every piece of evidence became more important than ever. The Laci Peterson case reached its climax with the discovery of Laci and Connor's bodies. The mystery of Laci's disappearance was gradually cleared up, but the big questions remained. Was Scott Peterson really the killer, or was this just April 12, 2003, a special day when all eyes were on Scott Peterson's trial? After months of investigation, evidence collection, and interviews with countless witnesses, the Laci Peterson case had reached a level of tension never seen before in American courtroom history. Police had found the bodies of Laci and her unborn child, Connor Peterson, but the most important question remained unanswered. Was Scott Peterson the killer? Scott Peterson sat in the courtroom, his face expressionless. During this time of waiting, he was held in the Stanislaus County Jail. All the public attention was on him, with angry eyes from people who believed he was the killer of his wife and unborn child. The trial took place in Modesto, California, where Laci Peterson and her family had lived for many years. The prosecution team, led by Attorney General George S. Harris, made a strong case that Scott Peterson was the culprit in the deaths of Laci and Connor, emphasizing that he had planned to kill his wife to be free with his lover Amber Frey. Yet, as he sat in the courtroom, Scott Peterson remained strangely calm, not panicking or showing any remorse. That was one of the strangest things about this case. The demeanor of a husband who almost everyone expected him to cry, to be confused. Instead, Scott maintained a cold exterior, making everyone more suspicious of him. All the evidence that had been collected during the investigation was presented at trial. The conversations between Scott and Amber Frey were recorded, and these tapes became one of the decisive factors in Scott's conviction. In phone calls between Scott and Amber, he repeatedly denied Laci's existence and even said he was living a separate life without his wife. In one notable call, Scott told Amber, "Laci doesn't matter anymore. I don't need her anymore." These words have led people to question whether Scott truly loved his wife. Or was he just a fake husband, an unrepentant cheater? Police have also collected evidence from Laci's last days alive. They found traces of Laci in the parking lot where Scott said he was fishing on December 24th, the day Laci went missing. Witnesses could not recall seeing Scott at the fishing spot, raising suspicions that he never left the Modesto area that day. One of the most shocking details was the investigation into the text messages and phone calls that Scott sent to his lover Amber Frey. Police discovered that Scott had convinced Amber that he was in the process of divorcing his wife and had left her for good. However, the truth was quite different. These details gradually exposed Scott's lies and led to an undeniable conclusion. Scott Peterson killed his wife. As the prosecution presented the evidence, Scott Peterson's defense attorney, Mark Garagos, tried to defend his client. Garagos claimed that there was no direct evidence that Scott killed his wife. He argued that the phone calls with Amber could not be relied on to conclude that Scott was the killer. Garagos tried to create doubt in the minds of jurors that Laci Peterson might have been murdered by someone else, and that Scott was simply the victim of a misunderstanding. Garagos's arguments, however, were not convincing. The circumstantial evidence implicating Scott, such as his absence during the crucial hours, his cold demeanor after his wife's disappearance, and the evidence from Amber's calls, were too strong to ignore. In particular, the discovery of Laci and Connor's bodies near the San Francisco Bay Area made Scott more seriously considered than ever. Witnesses continued to testify about Scott's change in demeanor after his wife's disappearance. They reported that he did not appear anxious or distressed, which was unusual for a husband dealing with a major loss. These signs left no doubt in the minds of jurors about Scott's guilt. Finally, after weeks of trial, on November 12, 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering his wife and unborn son. Laci Peterson was murdered on Christmas Eve 2002, and Scott used deception to cover up his crime. Although the defense tried to reduce Scott's sentence, the overwhelming evidence and testimony from witnesses left the jury with no choice but to conclude that Scott Peterson was his wife's killer. He was sentenced to death in 2004, but the sentence was later reduced to life in prison when there was no evidence to prove that Scott had intended to kill her. Premeditated murder. When the verdict was announced, the atmosphere in the courtroom became tense. The public was stunned, but not because of the surprise of the verdict, but because of Scott Peterson's coldness. He did not show any emotion when hearing the verdict, which made the public feel even more indignant. While Laci Peterson's family could not help but express their pain over the death of their loved one, Scott Peterson appeared silent and unrepentant. From the fierce developments in the trial, a big question still remains. Is Scott Peterson really guilty for what he has caused? Will the secrets behind Laci and Connor's deaths continue to be exposed in the upcoming trials? To learn more about the remaining clues in this case, as well as other shocking details related to Scott Peterson, please follow the next part of the documentary series, Laci Peterson Search. Clues by the Bay True Crime Documentary, Part 2. Let's explore the secrets that have not been revealed and learn more about the price to pay for the crimes that Scott Peterson committed.